Buonasera a tutti e a tutti, ben arrivati e benvenuti a questo primo incontro della seconda edizione del ciclo Voices from Contemporary Philosophy. È un ciclo che è nato l'anno scorso allo scopo di internazionalizzare un po' il curriculum di filosofia della nostra università, ma anche più in generale direi di arricchire la nostra comunità filosofica e accademica e pubblica di alcune voci significative del panorama contemporaneo filosofico e culturale. L'anno scorso abbiamo avuto modo di ascoltare alcune voci, tra cui quella di Axel Honneth e di Lia IP. Quest'anno, se possibile, cercheremo di sconfinare, a proposito di confini, ulteriormente, spingendosi anche al di là dell'oceano. Avremo infatti Wendy Brown da Berkeley, Lila Gandhi, Brown University, avremo Vittorio Ösle da Notre Dame e questa sera abbiamo il piacere di avere Achille Varzi, quindi Columbia University, e per la sua biografia e storia personale e intellettuale direi che il professor Varzi davvero offre un po' un ponte ideale tra Trento e gli States, quindi in questo senso davvero raffigura un po' questo sconfinamento e è un grande piacere averlo con noi. E stamattina ci ha già illustrato e piacevolmente intrattenuto appunto raccontandoci della sua storia e per questo gli sono e gli siamo penso molto grati per aver accettato l'invito ad essere qui questa sera. I will guess that we will now switch to English, given that it is an occasion for internationalizing our curriculum. And so I will give the floor to Professor Federico Laudisa to introduce our guest, and after him to Achille Varzi. Thank you to everybody for being here today, and enjoy most of all.
Thank you. So, good evening. Thank you, first of all, to Michele and Tiziana for organizing this second edition of this cycle, and thank you for allowing me to be here to introduce Achille Varzi, who is really one of the most important analytic philosophers in the whole international community. And we are happy to say that he obtained his first degree in philosophy here in Trento. Then he obtained a PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And then he went to Columbia University in New York, where he is actually John Dewey Professor in philosophy at Columbia. He's also Bruno Kessler Honorary Professor of Trento. We are again happy to say this. His areas of research are logic, philosophy of logic, and analytic metaphysics. He wrote many books, and I mention just some of them. 3 of them written with Roberto Casati. Holes and Other Superficialities in '94 for MIT Press. Parts and Places, again for MIT Press in 1999. And then Semplicità insormontabili, 39 storie filosofiche, published by La Terza in 2006 and translated in many languages. Then he wrote a book for Carocci entitled Parole, oggetti, eventi e altri argomenti di metafisica. And then he published in more recent times with Aaron Kotmar a book devoted to Mariology for Oxford University Press. He's a leading expert on Mariology. And he also wrote a book with Claudio Calosi, which is a rewriting of the hell of Dante Alighieri, with the idea that the sinners in hell are the defenders of many metaphysical claims. He also published many papers on really top journals. I mentioned some of these journals so you can realize how top these journals are. Logica Universalis, Journal of Philosophical Logic, Synthese, The Review of Symbolic Logic, Erkenntnis, The Monist, Analysis, Philosophical Quarterly, Mine, Australasian Journal of Philosophy, Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic. So I'm very happy and pleased and honored to introduce again Achille Varzi to you. I leave the stage to him with his talk, The Power of Boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I should say I am in some sense emotional tonight because as you mentioned, I did my undergraduate work here. I graduated from this university many years ago, and it's kind of funny to find yourself on the other side and giving a talk and contributing to such a prestigious lecture series. And so I would like also to extend my thanks to Professor Paitini and Professor Nicoletti and whoever else was involved in the organization of the whole series and of this particular event. And again, to Professor Giacomoni for a nice and thought-provocative conversation this morning. Thank you. It's really a pleasure. It's really an honor. I wonder if I can stand and make without creating problems with the camera and the microphone. Would that work? But I get the light. No, then I stand. I sit. Because otherwise I end up being in front of that. Okay, it's fine. The title, you see it, The Power of Boundaries. If you like subtitles, I'd be happy to offer one, and it would be this one. It will be From Politics to Metaphysics and Back. And in a way, my hope is to try and make sense of this, or why this would be a good subtitle to the official title that I offered. I'm going to start with, is the audio fine? Everybody hears me in the back? Okay, good. So I'm going to start with some pictures. In fact, I'm going to switch to this side. This side. I don't see it. Oh, great. Thank you. Good. So I'm. Thank you. Great, great. So this is a beautiful picture. It's an etching by Bartolomeo Pinelli. See what it is, right? It's Romulus plowing a line around the Palatine Hill. Question, what was so special about that plow, the plow furrow traced by Romulus, that it even cost the life of his brother who dared to cross it? Or consider this other example. You know what this is? This is the original sketch by Thomas Jefferson for the 1784 ordinance of the Northwest States. What magical powers did Jefferson's pencil have when he drew the lines that literally brought into being the Northwestern states? Here's another picture, the Berlin Conference, 1884-1885, organized by Bismarck. And it was all about the European partition of Africa. It started then, and eventually, this is what we got, the European partition of Africa. How could the colonial powers partition the so-called heathen lands among themselves just by drawing a few lines on a map? How could those lines be enough to split the entire African continent like a magnificent cake? It's in quotes because this, unfortunately, is the actual expression used by one of the people who were there. In fact, by one who could not attend, but sent someone in their place. It's the King of Belgium, Leopold, and said, oh, we have to go because this is a magnificent cake. We want to have our slice, referring to Africa, of course. So this boundary drawing is, of course, highly consequential. And of course, Africa is not the only place where, or for that matter, the Northwest of Northern America is not the only, are not the only examples. I mean, here is a history of Europe for the past 2,000 years, where you see the boundaries drawn century after century. It's all quite complicated. Yeah. quite complicated. Furrow after furrow, line after line, borders have filled our atlases and colonized our lives. To them, we have subjugated our actions and entrusted our history, our roots, our identity. This morning, Professor Giacomoni referred to Carl Schmitt. There are experts of Carl Schmitt in this room and in this university. This famous and very important book, The Nomos of the Earth, is all about this. The nomos is a matter of the fundamental process of apportioning space that is essential to every historical epoch. Every new age and every new epoch in the coexistence of peoples, empires, and countries, of rulers and power formulations of every sort, is founded on new spatial divisions, new enclosures, and new spatial orders of the earth. I mean, we could just spend the whole day talking about, of course, Carl Schmitt on borders and boundaries. Now, it's true, today, if you drive across Europe, it's what I call a jolly experience almost. You see a sign that says Österreich or Deutschland or Slovenia, and you just drive through. No custom barrier anymore, no passport control. Over Slovenia, it's become again problematic. It's a good reminder. But the point is that it's become, of course, much easier to go from one place to another, crossing boundaries. You just have a sign. You say, Austria, and you just carry on. The sign could be 100 yards further, and it will make no difference whatsoever. Yet, the fact remains that by crossing that line, that invisible line, you enter a different world district, magically separated from its surroundings. You enter a land where people suddenly obey different speed limits, the first thing you have to learn if you're driving, speak another language, rely on different authorities, on their own authorities, share a different heritage, and struggle to solve their problems and to improve the quality of their common life. All of a sudden, you just, one step and you are in a different world district. The line is there, even if you don't see it. And that sign conceals, of course, a long history, especially the one that I mentioned, Austria. Boundaries are, this kind of boundaries, borders, frontiers, national boundaries, are, to use a beautiful expression by Michel Fouché, traces of time inscribed in space. Boundaries are thin, yet powerful. They separate and thereby unite. They separate the others, but they unite those who are within. They may be invisible, yet a lot depends on them, including one's sense of belongingness to a country, a place, a people. How can, now this is a silly question in a way, but it's been bothering me for a long time, really. How can such a fine line, how can such fine lines in the plural be so powerful? Where does their power come from? Well, the answer, I think, should be obvious. It comes from us. And I think this is the answer that initially most people today will be happy to entertain. In Romulus' times, of course, one might have thought that the power of borders stemmed from their presumed sacredness. The plow translated the will of the gods into furrow, which is why the brother was killed. It's not just me, it's, that's there, it's the will of the gods. The Romans actually eventually had a god, Terminus, presiding over all boundary markers, with a major Terminalia festival celebrated yearly on the last day of their calendar. Today, luckily, I think we have learned to say that it is a matter of conventions, that this power is a matter of conventions, agreement, stipulations. Of course, not necessarily agreements and stipulations of the sort that we reach by sitting around the table. Sometimes it's war. People give their lives, there's blood. But eventually, people decide, okay, here it is. That's where the boundary is going to be. It may not be a good idea to make mock of them, not only because it will be, lacking respect towards those people who gave their lives, but generally speaking, it's not a good idea. This is a nice picture from a famous movie with Charlie Chaplin. There was no wall then between the United States and Mexico. So it may not be a good idea to make mock of them, but at least we know the power of borders is a political artifact. It resides in the authority of those who draw them and who draw the borders, the boundaries, and the consent of those who accept them. That's where the power comes from. This morning, Professor Giacomoni also mentioned Georg Simmel, whose writings on the topic of boundaries are extensive and extremely important, fascinating, influential. So here's a nice passage. He says, this is 1918. He says, no boundary is unconditional, since everyone can in principle be altered. Although the boundary as such is necessary, I mean, we don't live without boundaries, just like we cannot live without traffic lights, etc. Although the boundary as such is necessary, yet every single specific boundary can be stepped over. Every fixity can be displaced. Every enclosure can be burst. And every such act, of course, finds and creates a new boundary. It's us. We are creating all those boundaries. We are drawing all those lines. So the question still remains, though, so the power comes from us, but then why are such boundaries so powerful? In any case, I want now to point out that despite this, despite the fact that we are willing to say that it comes from us and that we may be happy to cite Simmel, who says, boundaries can be stepped over, the thought remains that perhaps not all boundaries are born equal, that perhaps there are some important differences here. And I want to, in fact, bring your attention to this fellow. I don't know if you recognize him. Does anybody recognize this guy? Maybe in this photo? No, right? I'm glad you don't know this person. He was not a nice man, I should say, but it was important for our purposes. This is George Curzon of Kellaston, Lord Curzon, who was for several years the British Viceroy of India under Queen Victoria first, and then under King Edward VII, and then Secretary for Foreign Affairs under King George V. Why am I mentioning this forgotten political figure? Because in 1907, after serving for many years in India, after taking care of the maintenance of some 5,700 miles of borders in India, he was invited to Oxford to give a lecture, one of the famous Romance lectures. And he chose as a topic, our topic, frontiers. And this little book, it's about 60 pages, is, despite what we might think of the political ideas of Lord Curzon, is actually a very important book. I strongly recommend that you all read it. In fact, I was responsible for a translation into Italian just last year, I think. I haven't seen it yet, but it should have come out. I forgot the publisher. But anyway, should be available also in Italian. In 1907, this guy goes to Oxford, politician, and talks about frontiers. And he knows what he's talking about. And he's very excited because he can finally make his point that a lot depends on frontiers. Now, he starts by saying, you might be surprised, but there's virtually no literature on this topic. We might be surprised to hear this. Of course, there is stuff on boundaries, but there is no science, no scientific study. Surely this is the first monographic treatment of our topic, and he was well aware of that. He says, the majority of the most important wars of the past century have been frontier wars. I mean, he gave this lecture, of course, the audience wasn't only Oxford students, it was also politicians and so on. So it was his opportunity to finally make his point. He said, wars of religion, of alliances, of rebellion, of aggrandizement, of dynastic intrigue or ambition, wars in which the personal element was often the predominant factor, tend to be replaced by frontier wars, meaning in the 19th century, also in the 18th century a bit actually. Wars arising, that is, out of the expansion of states and kingdoms, carried to a point as the habitable globe shrinks, at which the interests or ambitions of one state came into sharp and irreconcilable collision with those of another. He says, frontiers are indeed the razor's edge on which hangs suspended the modern issues of war and peace, of life and death to nations. Just as the protection of the home, this sounds like Donald Trump actually, but just like the protection of the home is the most vital care of the private citizen, so the integrity of her borders is the condition of existence of the state. Now, the book is interesting and important because it has a theoretical element. It actually offers a theory of boundaries. And the key idea is one that we are going to recognize as being kind of obvious, but which then was not obvious at all. The key idea is that there are two sorts of frontiers, two sorts of boundaries. Those frontiers or boundaries that are, as it says, afforded by the natural features of the Earth's surface, such as mountain ranges, ravines, coastlines, riverbanks, desert barriers, and so on the one hand. And on the other hand, those frontiers that, not being dependent upon any such landmarks for their selection, have instead been artificially created by us, by man, he says, and find their origin in the complex operations of trade, religion, and war. So natural frontiers or boundaries and artificial human-made boundaries. This simple contrast between, on the one hand, the boundary of Australia and on the other, the boundary of Austria should be enough to see what he's talking about, right? Now, he was not the first one, of course, to specify that there is a difference between these two kinds of boundaries. In fact, a few years before, 1897, 10 years before, Friedrich Ratzel, in what is still, I think, one of the most interesting treatises in political geography, had a section, you can see it here on page 489, a little section on natural versus artificial boundaries, but it's really just 12 lines, okay? And a few years later, 1905, so 2 years before the Romanes lecture by Lord Curzon, Lasse Oppenheim, in his book on international law, again has a section, natural and artificial boundaries. But they have very little to say about the importance of this distinction, whereas Curzon had a point to make. Why is that distinction important? Well, he says that a country with easily recognized natural boundaries, and of course, Britain, or as they say, Great Britain, is supposed to be one such. A country with easily recognized natural boundaries is more capable of defense and is more assured of a national existence than a country with artificial boundaries, that a country that is with a sea frontier, such as the British Isles, is in a stronger position than a country which only has land frontiers and requires a powerful army to defend them, that a mountain-girt country is the most secure of internal states. These are the fundamental principles of political geography. So his point was that there is, there's a big difference between a country whose boundaries, whose frontiers are natural, and those that are, by contrast, artificial. And he says everything can be explained in terms of this. Now let's go through a few illustrations. If you go to the part of America where I have been spending my recent life, which is to say the United States, you have interesting cases of boundaries that are clearly artificial, much less interesting actually than Austria, and in a way much less problematic. Colorado, it's really just a rectangle. In fact, it's almost indistinguishable from Wyoming. Your sense of identity doesn't quite depend on such boundaries. And it's not just a US thing. Canada, where I also spent 4 years of my life, has its own rectangular states, Saskatchewan. But more generally, Canada has other cases where the boundaries are artificial in such a way as to really be violent towards the underlying territory, towards the discontinuities in the underlying territory. This is the new state of Nunavut. Look, it really cuts across Victoria Island, ignoring the underlying territory. Exactly what happened actually with Africa after the Berlin meeting. And on top of it, all the boundary here of the Hudson Bay says that this belongs to Nunavut. So Quebec, Ontario are not quite happy about that. This is really an artificial, a demarcation. Indonesia is another good example. You see, there are even in Europe places where the boundary is completely broken into pieces. These pluses are national boundaries, and this is the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. The town of Baarle. It's crazy. You see, this belongs to one state, this belongs to another state. This belongs to one state, that belongs to another. If you go there, you see, that's the map you get. Half of it is Belgian, half of it is Dutch. And when you walk through the city, you have the national border right there. Luckily, you can just walk, you can really do what Charlie Chaplin did, but maybe there's something really artificial there. Here's another example. This goes through the house, literally. Got the kitchen on one side and the bedroom on the other. But we shouldn't laugh too much because in Italy, we have a similar case. The city, this is not a national boundary, it's a regional boundary, but the city of, or rather the town, or rather the village of Giugnola, about 250 people live there. You see, this is the regional boundary, Tuscany versus Emilia-Romagna. So if you come from north, you see the sign Giugnola, frazione di Castel del Rio, that's province of Bologna, Emilia-Romagna. But if you come from south, you find the cartello Giugnola, frazione di Fiorenzuola, province of Florence, Tuscany. And you can see exactly how this boundary goes through. And it's actually a nice book by Lorenzo Sani, Più sangue leri, which is about this. There is no English translation, but there's a page I translated, but in particular, at some point it says, there are houses where the living room is in Emilia and the bathroom is in Tuscany. I wasn't in a position to double check this, but what is interesting is that, or rather, interesting, informative, is that a few years ago when we had the COVID complications in our lives, this became a real problem because you couldn't, of course, leave your town for another, but you couldn't, of course, go to a different region. Actually, I don't think you could go even to a different province. You couldn't go from the province of Trento to the province of Verona region, or to the province of Bozen. But anyway, so people there had a problem because they had to go shopping and the shop was on the other side. And apparently people even got fined 500 euros for crossing the boundary. But it was, of course, an artificial boundary, badly or poorly drawn. Anyway, so I think we understand what an artificial boundary is and the pros and cons of drawing artificial boundaries one way or another. So we've got this intuitive distinction Artificial boundaries versus natural boundaries, okay? Artificial boundaries, such as the ones we've just seen and commented on, are fiat entities. I like to say this is a term that comes from Barry Smith. They are the result of complex decision-making processes, the product of collective intentionality that translates into social, political, and administrative agreements whereby it is determined where a certain territory begins and where it ends, okay? Such boundaries may be crisp, precise. For example, the border between two adjacent nations or states, it's very precise. Or fuzzy, vague. For example, the boundaries of a valley. What exactly are the boundaries of the Po Valley? Or the boundaries of a city's urban center, downtown Manhattan, or the boundary of a smoking zone. Oh, it's approximately here, but it's not drawn with similar precision. Why? Because they're not so important. It depends on the importance we assign to the relevant demarcations, on the role they play in our lives. If we say people living in the Po Valley won't pay any tax from now on, of course, it's important that we draw the boundary very precisely, but otherwise, there's no point. But whether crisp or fuzzy, such boundaries need not correspond to genuine physical or otherwise objective discontinuities or differentiations in the underlying territory. By contrast, I'm following Lord Curzon here, right? By contrast, natural boundaries are bona fide entities. They are characterized precisely by their apparent independence from our own organizing activities. They're not a byproduct of our practices, of our decisions, and so on. It wasn't we who drew the boundaries of Australia. It wasn't we who drew the boundaries of Sicily, for that matter. And it isn't we who draw the boundaries of a sea, a lake, a river, and so on. That's the intuition. So we may stipulate, for example, that one half of Lake Garda belongs to Trentino and the other to Lombardy. And the dividing line, like the line that goes through Giugnola, will be an artifact. But the shoreline, the border of the whole lake, doesn't seem to depend on us. It's just there. It exists on its own, so to speak. So that boundary is clearly artificial. But of course, the boundaries of the lake are there regardless of all of our conventions, right? They're still there. And those are supposed to be, as it were, natural boundaries, bona fide boundaries. Ditto for the boundaries of certain administrative or political entities, which, like Spain or Italy, are partly delimited by mountain chains. Spain is an interesting case because of the Pyrenees. I mean, those mountains, if you're interested in boundaries, have a very interesting, rich history. But since we're in Italy, it's enough to talk about Italy and to quote Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini said, God drew the most sublime, undeniable boundaries all around Italy. On the one hand, the sea, the immense sea. On the other, the highest mountains of Europe, the Alps. God drew those boundaries. Now, artificial boundaries may be subject to controversy, and people may fight and sacrifice their lives before an agreement is reached. They can be ignored or deleted and thereby go out of existence, and new ones can be drawn and thereby come into existence. That's why they are artificial, they're artifacts. And not so with natural boundaries. That seems to be the intuition, right? We are free to ignore them for political or administrative purposes, but we cannot ask a cartographer to omit them from a map of the world. In a physical map, we may omit all political boundaries, but a political map will perforce include all physical boundaries, at least those natural boundaries that are visible at the relevant scale. So again, we saw this before. So I can drop all the administrative information, but some boundaries, the natural ones, cannot be ignored. And what goes for lakes goes for islands. Okay, so good. Now, the distinction doesn't only apply to the large-scale geographic world that we find depicted in ordinary maps and atlases. I want to say that, of course, it applies across the board. To begin with, it also arises, for instance, in the smaller scale world feature in a cadastre, il catasto. Here, too, the parceling of land into real estate is not simply a geometrical affair. In some cases, it would seem to rely on natural pre-existing physical discontinuities, creeks, rocks, cliffs, ditches, and so on. In other cases, it is crucial that people believe and agree, which are intentional states, that whoever fenced off a plot of land is the person who actually owns it. So collective intentionality appears to be necessary to explain the difference, for example, the important difference between landed property and raw land. This is what happens. The whole territory is parceled this way, lines after line after line after line. And this is what our world looks like. Look at that. Good. Now, I want to say that it's a general distinction. So here we go, from the geopolitical world to the world of ordinary experience and beyond. Curzon's distinction has, I claim, applications and ramifications that go well beyond the geopolitical domain he had in mind. Boundaries stand out in every map we draw of the world at any level of representation, and so does the natural artificial distinction that they elicit. Absolutely any kind of map, not only the geographic maps. This is perhaps why Kant, of all people, spent so much time studying and teaching geography. He was, of course, very interested in the way we represent the world. And what better science of world representations is there than geography? I was mentioning this this morning. He taught a course called Physical Geography, which, however, covered also political geography, 48 times, second only to his course in metaphysics, 50 times, but very close, okay? Why would Kant do that? And by the way, he was really an expert, and he would read literature up to date in Italian, French, German, English. Because boundaries stand out in every map we draw, including the maps that we draw beyond geography. So take perception, for example. On the one hand, we tend to see and track the middle-sized objects in our environment on the basis of their natural boundaries, the natural boundaries they seem to possess. For example, think of edge detection techniques as developed in computer science, robotics, artificial intelligence, for object recognition. You know, computer vision uses such techniques. You've got a bunch of objects, and in order for a camera to eventually parse the image and extract them from the background, you do this. You do edge detection, boundary extraction. And that's really how it works. Doesn't have to be objects of the sort with the flowers, same thing, right? This is how computer vision has been developed for many years. But never mind that, it's very normal for us to identify objects, to represent, to draw things by drawing their boundaries. This is how children learn to draw, right? They draw the boundaries of houses, of flowers, and so on. And even when we plan things, when we imagine things, we do so by drawing the boundaries of those things. The boundaries are doing an enormous amount of work here. And since we're talking about perception, think of how important skylines have become and how they uniquely identify their city. Manhattan, of course, has a beautiful skyline. It's one reason why I love Manhattan. But every city now has their skyline. In fact, it turns out even Trento has a beautiful one. I didn't know that, but I found this beautiful image. This was 2018, I think. It was, or 2019, it was a big event in Trento. Anyway, silhouettes. Isn't that just boundaries? I mean, here there would be a whole chapter devoted to Gestalt psychology on the importance of boundaries too, but I'm going to skip that. Shadows. I mean, One reason why children tend to reify shadows and treat them as actual things is that they come with boundaries. I like this better, actually. Even holes. After all, why do we tend to reify holes? And in fact, this is also true of children. Again, there are interesting psychological results, precisely because they come with their boundaries. In a way, they are portions of reality which, like ordinary material objects, are bounded. They're separated from their complement in a similar way. So boundaries and our perception of boundaries, of course, are heavily at work here. But let's say all of these seem to be natural boundaries, right? In some obvious sense. The contrast is pretty, so to speak, objective. On the other hand, sometimes we parse the visual scene in terms of boundaries that involve the creative contribution of our perceptual apparatus. And so they're kind of artificial boundaries. Think of Impressionist paintings, Seurat, pointillism. So here's an example. Really, those are all dots, and we tend to extract boundaries this way. There are no boundaries, strictly speaking. They're just dots. But, you know, we do our boundary extraction nonetheless, right? We connect the dots, so to speak. And what we do, we also do with things. So, for instance, constellations are just that. Or think of birds. Beautiful. Wow, look at that. I think this is photoshopped. But anyway, you know what you see what I'm saying, right? Perception is just the beginning, though. We think of a boundary every time we think of an object as of something demarcated from its surroundings. Some demarcations seem naturally robust. For example, the surface of an apple, the boundary of my body. Other demarcations are clearly artificial. For example, the line separating my head from my neck, or my part of the desk from yours, or the boundary of a constellation. Not only objects, but also actions and other events have boundaries, including temporal boundaries. Artificial temporal boundaries, well, here are some examples. The end of the war, Anne's turning 18 years old, the boundary between the first half and the race and the second half. Clearly, these are conventional boundaries, right? To be something subjective or cultural or whatever. Natural temporal boundaries, well, here are some thoughts. Anne's birth or her death, the point in the cooling process where water begins to solidify. Those seem to be mind-independent boundaries. Even abstract entities, if you want, such as sets or concepts, may be said to have boundaries of their own. Think of Euler's popular method for representing sets by means of closed curves, like circles, within which all the elements are confined. One usually says those are Venn diagrams or Venn representations, but really, no, they go back to Euler. Venn had, but anyway, or think of Frege's demand that in logic, every concept, quote, must have a sharp frontier. He used the word frontier, sometimes translated as boundary, Grenze, okay? Now, those concepts expressed by substance sortals and so-called natural kind terms, tiger or water, for example, well, those would have natural boundaries. Those, by contrast, expressed by phase sortals, such as student. It's a phase sortal because it's not that you are a student, that's what you are. No, eventually you're going to be something else, but without going out of existence, right? Without losing your identity. Whereas a tiger cannot turn into something else. That's the idea. Student or jobless, those are phase sortals. Legal terms such as forbidden or married. Disjunctive predicates such as grew and bleen. Nelson Goodman. Well, those clearly have artificial boundaries. So you see, the distinction applies across the board. Now, is it a genuine distinction, though? That's the big question. By itself, I want to say that the distinction is perfectly intelligible, and we should, in a way, be thankful to this guy, Lord Curzon, for emphasizing its political significance. It's one thing to take up arms on the crest line of the Pyrenees or the Alps, quite another to sacrifice your life for a Jeffersonian line. It's not surprising that the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, wants a whole island of Ireland. But who would fight for the Wyoming Separation Party? Can you imagine such a silly thing? Oh, we want to be independent. This is our boundary. No, it's ridiculous. So if we want to understand why certain wars take place, whereas others don't, why some communities want to be independent, whereas others don't care, etc. Looking at the kind of boundaries they have is absolutely crucial. And I think in that sense, we should be thankful to Lord Curzon. Still, we should be careful not to fall prey to the rhetoric that may lie behind the distinction, natural, artificial, and the sense of geographic predestination that it evokes. So I mentioned the book Frontiers by Lord Curzon. A few years later, of course, Lucien Febvre published a very important book that some of you might have read. And Febvre says, within us, so deeply implanted that we no longer notice its hold on us, there is a certain idea of the natural limits of the great states, which causes us to think of their boundaries as things in themselves, having an actual value, a kind of mechanical virtue, and a compulsory and at the same time creative power. A whole philosophy of history is comprised in that word, natural. And of course, we saw earlier that Zimmel later on, actually even earlier, this is 1922, I think, but roughly at that time, was in fact saying that there are no natural boundaries. In short, does the distinction between natural and artificial boundaries correspond to a real difference, or is it just an intuitive distinction without a difference that we should kick away? Now, the question bites deeply. For once the distinction has been recognized, the distinction between natural and artificial boundaries, it can be drawn across the board, not merely in relation to boundaries, but also in relation to those entities that may be said to have boundaries, the things that have boundaries. If an entity enjoys natural boundaries, one may suppose that its identity, its survival conditions, and so on, do not depend on us. So those of you who have done metaphysics know what I'm talking about. The persistent conditions of things that have natural boundaries are, as it were, independent from us. That's a realist attitude towards those conditions. By contrast, if its boundaries, or some of its boundaries, some of them are enough to create troubles, if they are artificial, then the entity itself is, to some degree, a fiat entity, a product of our world making. We carve them out. And this gives rise to an anti-realist, or perhaps better, a constructivist stance, metaphysical stance towards the nature of the entities in question. They're not objective, they don't exist in their own, they depend on us. Now, that's not to say that fiat entities of this kind, of the second kind, are imaginary or otherwise irreal, non-real entities. I'm going to quote Frege from Die Grundlagen. He says, the objectivity of the North Sea is not affected by the fact that it is a matter of our arbitrary choice which part of all the water on the Earth's surface we mark off and elect to call the North Sea. This is not a typical quotation from Die Grundlagen, but it is an interesting thought, showing that Frege, even in his passing remarks, had interesting things to say. Obviously, the North Sea is objective. The water there doesn't depend on us. So what happens, rather, is that such entities would only enjoy their individuality, their being individuals of a certain kind, as a result of our selective strokes. A bit like the cookies carved out of the dough. So, yeah, there is the picture here. So suppose that the dough itself is actually natural stuff. Here, the example is not very good because that is by itself something that we have created. But never mind. Suppose that's the world, okay? And you're cookie carving things, objects, out of that big dough. This stuff here is objective. It exists regardless of you. But they're having their particular shape, and they're being now treated as cookies and having a certain a set of persistent conditions attached to them and so on. All of that depends on the baker's action of selecting them. Now, are there any natural boundaries there? That's going to be the big question. And I think the answer is going to be no. So in the end, Zimmer, I think, is right. Do I still have 10 minutes? Yeah, okay, good. I need some water. Take an island, for example. Sicily. What's the boundary of an island? Well, true, from the airplane, we have the impression of seeing its nice, neat shoreline, right? But it's also true that when you actually go there, ground level, things look very different. So that's your nice, beautiful little island. Natural, oh, it's got a nice natural boundary. And then, you know, you go down, down, down. And you realize that the nice little natural boundary, you know, where is it? It's water coming and going. There's a trade-off between the two sides. And where exactly is the boundary between the island and the ocean is an open question. There was a famous article published a few years ago, which was the beginning of the study of fractals. It was written by Mandelbrot, called "How Long is the Coastline of Britain?" And of course, well, you see the point, right? Where the hell is that nice line that I saw from the airplane? And of course, when you go there, it's also full of dead fish, cement, dirt, trash. I mean, it's really bad. And what goes for islands goes for all prima facie natural geographic entities, beginning with the much tall Italian peninsula. It may well be that the Alps are, as Mazzini put it, the most sublime, undeniable boundary the Almighty could have given us. But until recently, Italy and Switzerland were still working on an agreement to fix its exact location in view of its continual weathering transformations of the crest and watershed lines, rock erosion, glacier melting, and so on. And they said, wait a second, okay, sure, we are on this side of the Alps and you're on that side of the Alps. And we take the crest, but where is that crest? And they had to sit down. And here is the Disegno di Legge, Maggio 2008. You will recognize some of the politicians involved. Ratifica ed esecuzione dello scambio di note tra la Repubblica Italiana e la Confederazione Svizzera relativo ai confini mobili sulla linea di cresta o displuviale, eccetera, eccetera. They had to sit down and decide where to draw the line. And, you know, it's interesting to actually go through the details because these people really realize that we need to add something. There's a nice book by Ferrari and others, Moving Border, which is entirely about this issue and has a lot of interesting information about this. What about the rest, the other cases, the ones that go beyond the geopolitical world? What is exactly the boundary of an apple, for example? I said that's a natural boundary. Or the boundary of a flower. More generally, the boundary of a material object. Well, on closer look, actually, as we know, or as we should know, an apple is not a solid, continuous body. Now, Federico, allow me to be a little simplistic here. On closer look, material objects are just swarms of subatomic particles. Let's put it that way. You know, you can take it to be slightly metaphorical and not scientifically accurate, but you're going to see the point. On closer look, their boundaries involve the same degree of arbitrariness as that of a mathematical graph smoothed out of scattered and inexact data. The same degree of idealization of a drawing obtained by connecting the dots. The same degree of abstraction as the boundaries of things in a Seurat painting. I mean, literally, the volume of an apple is what 1/1,000,000th of what we tend to measure. The rest is these subatomic particles frantically going back and forth, and so on and so forth. So those natural boundaries aren't as natural and continuous as we thought they were. What is exactly the boundary of an event? The controversies on abortion and euthanasia, to be very explicit about how important these issues, of course, become as soon as we start thinking about that, well, they indicate that even the boundaries of our lives may be less natural than one might initially think. I mean, after all, when I gave you examples of natural boundaries, like birth and death, they come to mind immediately. But if you think about it, no, we keep fighting on where those boundaries are. On closer look, often it is a matter of deciding whether a person is still alive, or whether a person's clinic death coincides with the end of her existence. And the criteria that guide our decisions give expressions to our opinions, our beliefs, our theories, if you like. But something that comes from us. Give us a list of objections, of cases. So I say, well, okay, now is there a clear objective criterion by which we can initially identify the initial boundary of a person's life? The previous point was about the terminal boundary. So in this case, take the beginning of a person's life. Well, surely it's not the birth of that person, which is a very complex event, even though that's what we have on our passports. And now here come a bunch of proposals that people have offered to identify the beginning of a person's life. The moment of fertilization, when the membrane of the sperm cell fuses with that of the egg, or perhaps upon the formation of the zygote, or perhaps when the zygote begins to undergo a process of genetic replication and cell division. Others say no, upon formation of the morula. Others say the beginning of the implantation process. Others still say the beginning of the gastrulation process, which gives structure to the embryo, and so on and so forth. It's plenty of theories. Part of those are scientific proposals. They're not metaphysical suggestions. We can base our decision on as many factors as we like, including up to the minute scientific findings, but a decision it is. Choosing one versus the other options is to make a decision. And if it is a matter of our decision, then it's not a natural boundary, and even a person's life becomes to some extent a fiat process, a fiat event. What about, to conclude this part, and then I get to the final point, what about natural properties, kinds, taxa, the kind of stuff that biologists study? Here, things get more complicated since the relevant notion of a boundary is less clear. Surely, however, there's a difference between, say, a wholly arbitrary zoological classification, such as Borges' Chinese Encyclopedia, and the taxonomies that we actually find in the biological sciences. Just as a reminder, this is Borges. So animals are divided into A, belonging to the emperor, B, embalmed, C, tame, D, sucking pigs, E, sirens, F, fabulous, G, wild dogs, H, included in this classification, I, crazy acting, J, uncountable, K, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, L, etc. So you see, a crazy classification. Surely scientific classifications are not like that. Yet, we all know that the latter, the ones that we find in the biological sciences, they too are the product of theoretical criteria that are constantly in flux, reflecting cultural circumstances and practical concerns of various sort. Surely quadrupeds do not form a natural kind, but why settle, for example, on the difference between horses and zebras, as we actually do? In a nice paper called Unnatural Science, Catherine Elgin says, it would be remarkable if a taxonomy that draws the distinction between horses and zebras where we do aligned at all well with natural categories suitable for describing the cosmos as a whole. So highly objective, but indifferent to human faculties and ends. The thought that the taxa countenanced by biology are conventional seems to clash with the certainty of biologists on the objectivity, on the objective reality of evolution, Yet, even today, taxonomists base their classifications more on phonetic than on phylogenetic criteria. And in phonetics, a natural classification is simply one in which the members of each taxon are, on the average, more similar to one another than they are to members of other taxa at the same level. We shouldn't shudder if, in the end, we read in no less than the Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics, which is the top journal when it comes to biological classifications, that, quote, taxa are human constructs. What? And, quote, natural taxa are those that are natural to humans. This is not a postmodern philosopher from Paris. This is the Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics. And we shouldn't complain if non-human animals, in fact, have different tastes. After all, there are, yes, horses and zebras, but also zorses and hebras. I forget which is which. One is male, female, the other is female, male. And of course, there are also, look how beautiful this one is, tigons and ligers. No, these are, you know, and, you know, they can even live together with lions and tigers. So, of course, there are limits. You cannot have an elephant with a mosquito. Yeah, fine. But that's not as well a biological issue. All right, realism and anti-realism. So you see where this is going. And I'm getting to the end. In the Phaedrus, Plato famously puts it in terms of the butcher, right? He says, the goal in the method of division is to be able to cut up each kind according to its species along its natural joints, and to try not to splinter any part as a bad butcher might do. Now here, the natural kinds are not only those of biology. I mean, this is really the category in terms of which we understand reality, right? The idea is that we should carve the world along its natural joints. Now, if all boundaries were the product of some cognitive or perhaps social fiat, if the lines along which we splinter the world, the lines along which we carve out objects, properties, kinds, etc., depended entirely on our cognitive makeup and on the categories that we employ in drawing up our maps of the world, then our knowledge of the world would amount to neither more nor less than knowledge of our own maps. We wouldn't, I mean, this is much worse than Kant, right? We're just learning how we treat the world. We're not learning anything about the world. That's why people don't like this. Plus, of course, there is going to be relativism, cultural dependence, etc. The thesis according to which all boundaries, hence all entities, are of the fiat sort would take us straight to an extreme form of hermeneuticism. Remember the slogan, there are no facts, just interpretations. Some people are afraid of this. I mean, the Pope even wrote an encyclica to defeat this view, right? Not the current Pope, the previous one, Ratzinger, who was a philosopher. On the other hand, as I hope the examples I gave show, to posit the existence of genuine bona fide boundaries, to think that the world comes pre-organized into natural objects and properties reflects a form of naive realism that doesn't seem to stand close scrutiny. It would be nice if things were that way, but it's not, they're not. So what? At this point, I say, well, here, your favorite story, because this is where different philosophies and different philosophies of science in particular, of course, have a lot to say. One of my favorite views here is the one that comes from Sally Heslanger. I'm just going to quote a representative statement, but then I'm going to conclude with 3 very simple remarks, because I want everyone here to plug in their view. My purpose is to take you to this point and to see how important this decision is going to be, because everything depends on it. She says, even someone who believes that our scientific concepts perfectly map the nature map nature joints can allow that scientists come to have the ideas and concepts they do through social historical processes. After all, social and cultural forces may help us develop concepts that are apt or accurate and beliefs that are true. I like this position. I think it's wishful thinking in the end of the day. I think that if you are convinced that the boundaries are not, that there are no natural boundaries, that there are no objective boundaries, that everything is the result of our own projections and so on, then the idea that we can still talk about natural joints is just wishful thinking. But anyway, it's an interesting position because Celis Langer, of course, is a major figure when it comes to social constructivism, but she's not giving up completely on, for example, the pursuits of science according to some traditional criteria, etc. As I said, I'm going to conclude with three very simple remarks. The first is simply the following. Anti-realism or radical constructivism, the claim that all boundaries are artificial and therefore all things are the result of our word making, doesn't mean metaphysical idealism, as some people seem to think. The doctrine that all entities are the product of mind-dependent delineations does not imply that the world itself is an offspring of our produktive Bildungskraft, of our productive, or as I said earlier, organizing activities. Even if the structure of the world were determined entirely by our perceptual and conceptual categories, the status of the world as a whole is not at issue. The debate concerned exclusively the status of its citizens, not the world itself, and whether they come in two sorts, natural versus artificial. Indeed, and here's the key point, almost an argument, I would say, against idealism, not only is the anti-realist stance that I'm presenting compatible with the existence of a mind-independent world, a mind-independent reality, it presupposes it. Why so? Because all artificial boundaries are, in geography as elsewhere, boundaries that we draw on some pre-existing underlying reality. We need some stuff in order to use our cookie cutters. We need some world in order to draw boundaries. The stuff, the world are there, they exist independently of us. This is not idealism. The world is perhaps much less structured than we're used to think. It's a desert, the Quanian desert, for those of you who know what I have in mind. And we're drawing lines in the sand, but it has to be there in order for us to draw our things. So this is not idealism, don't worry. Second, it doesn't imply epistemological nihilism either. As long as anti-realism is distinguished from idealism, truth and falsity work in the presence of artificial delineations exactly as they're supposed to work in the presence of natural boundaries. It is a mistake to think that because you're a social constructivist, for example, or an anti-realist of the sort that I have described, then truth and falsity, fail to apply. Gianni Vattimo used to think so. I remember I had lots of discussions with him, and I said, no, this is what Berlusconi would like to think. Why do you think so? It's exactly the opposite. Every predicate has an extension, artificial as it may be. Every singular term has a referent, name, descriptions have a reference, arbitrarily demarcated as it may be. And the subject-predicate sentence is going to be true if and only if the referent of the subject falls within the extension of the predicate. Surely the boundaries of Wyoming are artificially drawn. Yeah, that makes no difference to truth so long as we agree on where they're drawn. So if you're inside Wyoming, so either you're inside Wyoming or you're outside. The fact that Wyoming is being drawn artificially doesn't, of course, prevent me from saying this. And if I say, here comes my subject-predicate sentence, you are, say, inside Wyoming. When you are on the other side, when you are outside, then my claim is simply false. Who cares about the fact that the boundary has been drawn artificially? The claim is either true or false. There may be vagueness, of course. Not all boundaries are traced with precision, but so be it. Precisely because the boundaries are our own making, Any such vagueness would be merely linguistic or cognitive at large. It certainly doesn't mean that the vagueness bites at the ontological level. Truth and falsity work the same way in the realm of natural facts, which would be fixed entirely by the world, and in the realm of conventional facts, which require collective intentionality. The realist acknowledges facts of both sorts, natural and artificial, and may want to keep track of the difference by distinguishing, for example, between, and I'm sure this terminology is familiar to everyone, laws of natures and laws of rights, bona fide laws and fiat laws in the language that I prefer. But a law is a law, no matter where it comes from. It's interesting that we use the same word, laws of natures and the laws of jurisdiction. If the traffic code sets us on a speed limit and we drive faster, then it is a fact that we break the law and deserve a fine. We cannot say, oh, I'm not going to pay because, you know, it's all a convention after all. No, I'm sorry. You can't dispute that. You deserve a fine and you pay. It is a fiat law, and as such, it is both arbitrary and ephemeral, but a law it is for the realist and the anti-realist alike. The extreme anti-realist just says that all laws are of this kind. And finally, anti-realism doesn't mean anything goes-ism. This is a reference to Feyerabend. You know, well, then anything goes. No, why anything goes? I don't think the expression anything goes-ism is legit, but I like it. So once the idealist and the nihilist worries are dispelled, as I hope I've shown, what's wrong with the idea that all boundaries are the result of arbitrary decisions? With the similar thought that you can, you know, step on anyone. Arbitrary doesn't mean that anything goes. It means that it is entirely up to us in arbitrio nostro to draw the relevant lines to affect the articulations that we think are best suited to our needs. We are responsible for those lines. That's what it is, what it means for them to be arbitrary. If we just replaced Plato's natural joints with Jefferson pen strokes, it would be a disaster. I agree. And unfortunately, that's what happens in many cases. We saw it with Africa. We saw it with the city of Barley. We saw it with the village of Juniola, but never mind geography. In general, this is a bad idea, right? As Curzon knew well, the pencil and ruler method for drawing boundaries doesn't always pay. Quote from his book, "It is said in America that many men reside in one state and do their business in another. And there is no reason why so artificial a divide should not have even more inconvenient consequences." Meaning those boundaries have been drawn poorly and they're not good. In fact, he should have known better. I mean, Curzon. The partition of Africa, which had taken place when he was giving his lecture, he was not unaware of how it took place. The partition of Africa during the years of new imperialism is one of the darkest periods in our history. Why does it give us this silly example of the American businessman? Talk about Africa, please. Classifying people on the basis of their skin color, sexual orientation, or IQ scores has produced way more damages than any Borges encyclopedia. Yet, precisely here, in their arbitrary character, lies all the potential of artificial boundaries. I say now potential as opposed to power, but in a way, it is the power of boundaries, but it becomes a positive, as it were, sense of power. Why so? Why is it now a good thing to realize that such boundaries are arbitrary? Precisely because arbitrary means in our arbitrio. If we realize that they work poorly, we can change them. This is something we discussed this morning. If they fail to measure up to our needs, we can try and replace them with better ones or get rid of them altogether. If a traffic light doesn't work, just remove it. It is much more difficult, enormously more difficult, to revise our maps, not just the geographic ones, but the maps in the broader sense that I tried to illustrate. If we think that some boundaries have been drawn by nature, even worse, if we merely pretend that have been drawn by nature, as some rhetoric wants to do. So this is my last slide. It's from the end of this book by Lord Curzon. He says, after spending 68 pages on this natural artificial business and the importance of the distinction and how good natural boundaries are, how difficult it is to maintain the artificial ones, etc., he says, well, there's also a class of so-called natural frontiers, which have been obliged to omit as possessing no valid claim to the title, namely those which are claimed by nations as natural on grounds of ambition or expediency, or more often sentiment. I mean, perhaps in Mazzini's case, it was just a sentiment. But Danton, talking about the boundaries of France, wasn't just sentiment. That was ambition. I didn't quote Danton, but still, you can imagine what he said. And generally speaking, it was more than that. And then he says, last sentence, the attempt to realize frontiers of this type, frontiers which are not natural but claim to be natural, has been responsible for many of the wars and some of the most tragic vicissitudes in history. And I agree. And for that reason, I think we should, and we see that today too, unfortunately, how terrible this is. The thought that these boundaries are really have been drawn by God or by nature or by whatever, by the world. So I end here with a photo of the Berlin Wall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Achille, for your talk. Very stimulating as always. So we can open the discussion. I can bring this microphone to anyone who wants to raise a question or do a comment or whatever. Can I break the ice? My point concerns your idea of realism versus anti-realism. So my feeling was that being an anti-realist, you tend to present realism in rather rough terms. So of course you don't think that, but from what you said, you tend to suggest that realism is just naive realism, and that's all. So on my side, I tend to remark that there can be sorts of more sophisticated realism in which, for example, my point was this, that when you talk about realism, you should take into account the idea of the role that theories play in proposing some, representation of reality. So that of course, realism need not be so rough, can be a kind of a regulative idea, so that we do not state that our theories get to reality, but simply that we tend to produce better theories if we suppose that every once in a while we touch reality. Otherwise, probably science would not become what did.
I think I can use this microphone. Yes. Yes, the realism I presented is a naive version of it, and it's not fair in many ways. I'm going to comment on that in a second. First, I'm going to, however, comment on your second remark. I personally think that even the kind of realism that you have described is sinning in that there's this idea that we get closer and closer to the truth. I agree that somehow we have to touch reality, so that I like that. But they were getting closer and closer, in my opinion, is wishful thinking again. I mean, Copernican revolutions are, they happen all the time. Everybody who studies with you philosophy of science, I'm sure at some point you make them read Kuhn and you talk about paradigm changes and all of that, right? So there is this, what is it called, meta-induction argument. Every once in a while, we were discussing it also this morning, I think, every once in a while we have to give up our theories and we replace them with different ones, right? So it's not that the new one is better than the previous one in the sense that it gets closer. It just replaces it. Sometimes it's completely different. We said the sun moves around the earth. Now we said the earth moves around the sun. That's not getting closer. That's just turning it around. It's completely different, okay? So I'm not entirely sure about this this notion of progress. That being said, I agree with you that, of course, there are many versions of many interesting formulation of a realist stance, especially in scientific realism. My colleague Philip Kitcher tried to convince me many times that realism is compatible with pluralism. You know that there is this brand of scientific realism. Philip Kitcher is one, but there are others. Yes, fine. So let me refine, therefore, my target, my straw target as follows. The sort of realism that operates not so much at the level of, say, quantum mechanics, not the kind of realism that you need to presuppose if you're doing quantum mechanics, not the kind of natural boundaries that might be identified at the level of quantum mechanics. I'm not denying that there may be natural boundaries down there. What I'm saying is that all those boundaries that traditionally we've been treating as natural, because they are boundaries not at the microscopic level or at the macroscopic level, but at the mesoscopic level, the intermediate level, the level at, of things our size, what J.J. Gibson would have called the ecological level. Those boundaries are ours, are drawn by us. And that's where metaphysics has been focusing for, at least in the Western tradition, for over 2 millennia. And I think that's where all the damage that we're talking about here, Curzon was admitting it with reference to the history of humanity vis-a-vis fake natural political boundaries. I think the same can be said about fake metaphysical boundaries. I think all that damage remains, even though you can be a realist of a much better sort when you do science at some level of description of the world. Perhaps there are too many natural boundaries. Maybe the right view isn't that there are no natural boundaries. The right view might be just the opposite. The world is full of natural boundaries. But to do anything useful, we have to select some as opposed to others. And therefore, again, which boundaries eventually get to do the work have been selected by us. The fact that they are natural doesn't mean much because it's full of natural boundaries. Perhaps every geometric line is a natural boundary in some sense. And so that's the kind of worry that I'm interested in.
We might put this way that to translate your natural term as theory-free, okay?
Yeah.
Which doesn't imply that all theories are equal.
Absolutely, correct.
This can
I am happy to sign this document.
Okay, but we don't want this to be a private conversation between Achille Varzi and myself.
Thank you, Professor Varzi, for the lecture. I just have one small question regarding one of the last slides that you showed us, because you said that so your anti-realism does not imply a metaphysical idealism, and you affirm that it presupposes a mind-independent reality. So my point is, what are the elements that you include in this independent reality? Because, for instance, pain or pleasure, I'm not a philosopher. I actually come from philosophy of law, so I study in the building frontier. So maybe it's a naive question. But
no, it isn't. On the contrary, I think it's a very important question.
And
Thank
also the second one, can you support? Okay, you support an anti-realism, but are you maybe ready to support a moral realism?
Modal?
Moral
Moral.
or not.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
That's also very important. Thank you. So let me start from the second. For the simple reason that it's so important and so difficult that I'm going to leave it to a very short answer. But the short answer is yes. Also, with respect to the domain of ethics, I think the same kind of story would apply. So I am a more anti-realist, if you like, categories or labels, as opposed to more a realist. This morning, we briefly mentioned the Euthyphro dilemma, whether things are good because the gods think so, or by contrast, the god, sorry, because the gods like them, or by contrast, the gods like them because they're good. I think things are good because the gods like them. Of course, we don't have the gods anymore, it's us, but it's basically a pragmatist account of the good and the bad. It's a long story. I realize that this is where anti-realism is really hard to defend. And I see, I'm the first one to be scared by this kind of thought. I'm the first one to find it extremely difficult to accept it. But in my opinion, that's the way things are. And in my opinion, we just need to learn how to live with this. This morning I mentioned aesthetics and the beautiful. There we have no problem saying, oh, it's in the eye of the beholder. You know, the difference between beauty and not beauty. Few people think, especially today, that beauty is objective. Well, same story for moral values, even though the analogy, of course, isn't enough to justify the claim that it's the same story. So I wrote a little book on this. It's called I colori del bene. The idea being that il bene is like a color. Now, the first question is different. It's about how much structure this underlying reality is supposed to have. I mean, the one that we're presupposing when we draw lines, right? I mentioned, you know, a big dough, a big amorphous sort of reality. But is there some structure at least? Maybe not a beautiful Aristotelian or Platonic organization of things into objects and properties and so on, but some kind of structure? Well, yes. Otherwise, I would be, again, defending a view that goes beyond what I have in mind, namely a view that in contemporary philosophy may be associated with one of the many versions of Hilary Putnam, according to whom there is no univocal way of speaking of this underlying reality and of using cookie cutters, etc. No, I think there is, and I think it has some structure. It's very simple, very poor. It's basically geometric structure. In fact, I want to be more specific here, even though it gets more technical. I think it's a structure in terms of parts and wholes, wholes with a W. Whether or not X is part of Y doesn't depend on us. And more generally, this is mereology. So my latest book, even though I've been working on mereology for more than 30 years, but in fact, the latest book is called Mereology. It's all about this relation X is part of Y. And I think the world has a mereological structure that's mind independent. More than that, I think it also has a topological structure that's mind independent. So whether or not A and B are in contact, or whether or not A is inside B, doesn't depend on us. So this topological structure, which is not quite geometry because measures don't play any role, but which is in the spirit of a geometric structure, in my opinion, that's part of the dough, of the big dough. I cannot, I mean, there are limits, therefore. This goes actually also back to some of your remarks when you say somewhere we do touch the world, which means that the world does impose some limits on what we can do. In my opinion, those limits are of this kind. So we cannot violate the laws of mereotopology. Umberto Eco, in one of his latest later books called Kant and the Platypus, has a first chapter. I mean, that book is interesting for various ways, even though I don't think Umberto Eco, as a philosopher, contributed many promising ideas. But there is an interesting idea. His idea is that we should replace. So he's happy. We even had, in fact, an interesting meeting at the publishing house La Terza. A few years ago, they used to organize nice meetings. And I had the honor of having Eco as a commentator on a paper that I wrote, my first paper on boundaries. And his view is, in my opinion, interesting. And you can find it in the first chapter of the book on Kant and the Platypus, which he wrote when he was 70 and had already, I don't know, 15 laurea honoris causa, and had a movie made out of his novel with Sean Connery. As, you know, come on, give me a break. And you spend your evenings writing a book on Kant and the Platypus? His view is this: there are no one ways along which you have to cut reality. So the natural joints aren't of that kind. No obligations. There are, however, some no entry signs. So you can cut it in many ways. So you're not obliged to follow the Plato butcher metaphor. So there's room for pluralism. There are many ways of doing the job well, but not every way is acceptable because the world prevents you from doing certain things. I think that's true in a minimalistic way, only mereotopologically. He thought it actually forbids you from doing all sorts of other things that I think are perfectly legitimate, even though perhaps disgusting. So in my opinion, for instance, genetically modified organisms are terrible, are disgusting. But I'm not going to say that the reason why they're terrible and disgusting is that they are unnatural or that they go against nature. Because as soon as I concede that, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to reject the locution goes against nature in other contexts. No, I think genetically modified organisms are terrible for a number of other reasons. They're violent. I think the industry that comes with it is terrible. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons that I can offer without buying into an explanation in terms of going against nature. I'd like to say, oh, it's humans playing God or humans playing nature. That's fine. That's why they're bad, because I don't think we should do that. But not because nature is actually doing a lot of work and we're taking that away from her. No, nature isn't doing much work, only mereotopology. We pretend to do the work of nature when not even nature is doing that work. But here, perhaps you have a different notion of nature and it gets complicated. But thank you. Those are very important questions. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. I'd like to hear your opinion on two aspects. The first one would be, to what extent is this tendency to draw boundaries typical of a Euro-American worldview? And the other, which is probably connected, to what extent is this tendency also the result of the emergence of monotheisms?
Monotheism.
Yes, in the plural.
Yes. When you say this way of doing boundaries, you mean the view that they're artificial, that they are artificial?
The use of drawing boundaries.
Yes. Well, that's a good question. I think there's something interesting in the following respect, that the sort of view that I've been describing and the sort of view that comes from, say, French postmodern metaphysics and philosophy are very close, actually, even though the path is very different. If you read a North American analytic philosopher such as Nelson Goodman, his book, Ways of World Making, holds views that are even much more radical than the ones that I have described. And in fact, not even endorsed, described or presented today. And much more radical for him, really, there is no underlying world at all. It's really kind of idealism. But still, if you read that and you read some contemporary French postmodern philosophers, you realize that they're actually very similar. Even Hilary Putnam got very close. And they've been called traitors. When Goodman published the book, Ways of World Making, his friend and colleague, in fact, next door, Wheeler Quine, with whom they had co-authored papers and important works in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. When the book came out, Quine wrote a review for the New York Review of Books, something that never happens in the Anglo-American tradition, that a colleague writes a review of the book of someone who's a colleague. We don't do that on the other side of the ocean. But it was a negative review. They said, oh my God, this is really a slippery slope. We're going to go down the drain this way. This is going to be, we need a bottom. We need, and physics is going to give it to us. He was, of course, defending a physicalist. So he was very worried about this kind of anti-realism, this kind of relativism, etc. And then, again, God forbid, Goodman wrote a reply to the review. Never happens in history that someone, you can complain, verbally, etc., but you never really respond to a review by saying, I think you misunderstood my book. But that's exactly what he did. They were next door, right? Same department. That's to show that really these people were developing views that others had, in fact, fought against in various ways. Now, therefore, I don't know exactly where they come from geographically, so to speak. But I think there may simply be different ways to get there. Now, monotheism is obviously one of the looming motivations, if you like, for a realist attitude, right? There is one God. That's that. Already here, there is a realist attitude, of course. So monism in general tends to be the result of a realist attitude. Monism in science, monism in ethics. Monism is opposed to pluralism, not monism with respect to the mind-body problem, not that kind of monism. But, and of course, monism with respect to theological issues and the Almighty is similarly a strongly realist position, I think. And if you have that belief, then I think it is impossible not to be a realist with respect to a number of boundaries. Because otherwise you would live with God, but there's an empty religion. No, God says, okay, but everything is up to you now. I give you a world that's just complete, it's a desert. I don't know of religions that are like that. Typically, they come with views, laws that have implications in ethics, they have implications in a number of respects, and they are grounded in boundaries that are supposed to be natural. No question about that. If you have many gods, like the Romans, even there, I think they thought that there are natural boundaries, right? But they were not too serious about their gods. I think the Romans, I don't know, there are experts here about the ancient religion, but I think they simply were not too serious. So, but sorry, it's kind of a tentative answer.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Maybe it still is a little bit confused, but I'm asking about this problem of borders. Does not imply your argumentation a certain idea of identity, in the sense we have to say what an apple is, what is not an apple, or we have to say what Italy is and what is not Italy. But if we think of identity in a different way, as the result of a relationship or of a dialectics, for example. Does this problem still stand or not?
Well, that's again an interesting and important question. Yes, I think we're still going to have the same kind of problem, but I welcome your suggestion to make room for accounts of identity with all the problems that such accounts may bring in their wake that are, for example, based on relational treatments, interactions of various kinds. So where my identity is not something that I can find in myself, for example, but in my ways of interacting with others. Now, notice that this notion of identity that I think you are talking about, it's a kind of personal identity that's very different from the one that's captured by the relation of identity, which we study when we talk about, for example, identity through time, whether the ship of Theseus is the same after changing parts, or whether my body is the same as me, or whether the table is the same as the sum of its parts, or whether the statue is the same as that lump of clay. These are relational claims. So we have an identity relation, but that's different from identity in the sense in which we talked today about, for example, gender identity or personal identity, etc. This other notion of identity seems to be much more intimate, much less open to conventions and things that come from outside. But I think in the end of the day, it isn't well protected against the influence and the boundary drawing practices of ourselves and everyone outside us. So I think in the end of the day, we have similar issues. But relationality is in a different sense. Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a very inspiring and rich lecture. We have learned a lot. Go straight to the point of your conclusion. If I correctly understood, your final thesis is that it is much more difficult to change something, to change boundaries, if we consider this kind of boundaries as natural rather than artificial. So I would say that this is quite a progressive argument in favor of artificiality of boundaries. And I totally agree, but in some historical periods of our Western experience, for example, the reference to natural law against the law of right or positive law, whatever you would like to call it, played a very important revolutionary role. And I think that also in other contexts, for example, against the colonization and so on, the reference to nature, even if we know that it is not a fact, but play a role in changing something that has been imposed, not by an agreement, but by the stronger will.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. But even, even in contemporary political debates, the thought that everything is artificial or socially constructed turns out to be more problematic than one would like to be. That's why Sally Haslanger, in fact, doesn't want to go all the way and say everything is socially constructed. And the reason is the following: that well, it's hard to pinpoint the exact reason, except for conceding that there are some natural boundaries out there. But take, for instance, Black Lives Matter. This is a political movement, okay? It's not an academic conversation. It's a big thing. And now take the idea, which has become relatively popular today, that not only gender is socially constructed, but races are socially constructed, okay? In fact, there was a huge debate about 5 years ago because someone published an article in the journal Hypatia, which is the strong feminist. It started as a feminist philosophy journal, and now it's broader. And she published an article saying, well, just like I can choose my own gender identity, because it's socially constructed, gender, not sex. I may be born in a certain body, but likewise, I'm free to choose my race and identify, for example, as a Black woman, even though in fact I was born in a white body. She was, of course, crucified. I mean, it was a huge fight, and Black women in philosophy said, how dare you even think what it is like to be a Black woman? And now, this is an extremely delicate debate, okay? Because on the one hand, a feminist, a woman cannot tell a transgender person, cannot tell today in the current cultural scene, cannot tell a transgender person, oh, how do you dare, how can you even think what it is like to be a woman, right? Because this is homophobic, transphobic. But in the case of race, it's been, the response has been very different. So why is that so? Isn't there some work being done by the thought that there is something objective, that there is an objective difference, that you cannot just pretend whatever you want? In fact, people who are against, let's say, progressive views on such topics mock the progressive views and people by saying silly things such as, okay, I identify as a penguin, or, there are many cases of this sort that you have, I'm sure, heard of, including this politician, I think in Florida, who said, a white man who said, I identify as a Black woman. But in fact, I'm going to be a lesbian because I like women. Now, this person is obviously making fun of the sense in which there are no boundaries to where you can identify, and that the identification itself is your decision. I cannot say whether or not you're doing something right or whether or not you are. No. These kind of debate shows, sorry, it's a long story, but it's incredibly difficult and incredibly delicate, but shows that even these highly progressive movements seem to require objective demarcations, objective features of reality in order for their battle to fight for their, let's say, fights to be successful. Black Lives Matter, to go back to the starting point of my story, would be much less effective if it goes with the thought that being Black is socially constructed. What the heck? The American police people who treat and kill Black people in terrible ways are killing Black people who are Black, not in a socially constructed way. They're Black in some given way. And feminists who have been fighting for the past 50 years against discrimination, they have been talking about women as a given. I think I can say that historically. And in fact, today there are issues precisely because a tradition of, let's call, I don't know if the term traditional feminism is used, is still used, but let's say there are issues between the way in which certain delicate battles have been conducted with respect, for example, to personal space and so on, by women up to, let's say, the 90s, and the way in which those are conducted today, where, of course, the category of being a woman, the gender category, is seen as being socially constructed, and so even people who are born, for example, in a male body qualify as women, may identify as women. Now, this is, from a political point of view, I'm saying, exactly the sort of issue they're talking about. It was certainly much easier before to do politics in a certain way than it is today. Because before, you took much more for granted as naturally given, including the notion of being a woman, the notion of being a Black. As soon as these notions are socially constructed, it's much more difficult to give substance to a movement such as Black Lives Matter, or to feminism, and so on and so forth. It's called feminism, by the way, and the word female tends to refer to the sex, not to the gender in English. So even the word is actually now problematic. It's all a bit of a mess. And so it's a long story. I think it's extremely important. We are really finally dealing with very important issues here, but you may be right that some revolutions, even as you said, have been in the past and probably will be in the future, conducted on the basis of a modicum of realism. Without it, it's probably more difficult. Let's put it this way. In fact, lots of people are not going to be happy, like the Black women in philosophy who felt offended by this highly progressive female philosopher who said, I can identify as a Black, just like you can identify as a woman. And yeah, so are we going to draw boundaries here? How do we handle this? That's really where I think we need to be creative in our redrawing of the map of the world. We need to be creative because there are points of tension here that we need to work out, to sort out. Pretending that there is an answer out there, in my opinion, is not going to help us. But at the same time, probably just saying it's all conventional is not going to deliver a totally satisfactory picture, meaning lots of people are not going to be happy. So perhaps treating something as natural is the right thing to do in some regards. Yeah, very complicated, very complicated. The nomos, it's very complicated.
We may thank
Thank
Achille
you.
Varzi once again for your presence here.